of person with a soul trying to fly.
Tonight, comedian Dave Chappelle once again at the center of a swirling controversy.
Oh, buddy, I'm in trouble.
Now to a GMA exclusive, 2 transgender high school runners, well, they're kicking up dust in Connecticut, taking the top spots at the state girls championship, leaving parents wondering if they have an unfair advantage.
Gender is a fact. This is a fact. Every human being in this room, every human being on earth had to pass through the legs of a woman to be on earth.
Critics characterizing the remarks as transphobic.
When he was about 2, he came to me with Mr. Potato Head earrings and asked me to put makeup on him. So we did a little drag photo shoot and he duck faced. It was very sweet. And yeah, anytime he wanted makeup, I just put some on him.
I agree, man. Gender is a fact.
Trans activists are an enemy to the very people they claim to represent. I wholeheartedly believe they are doing vastly more harm than good, existing only to create contempt towards transgenders the world over. This in part due to their endless cycles of rage and accusatory rhetoric, actions which push otherwise supportive individuals away. If acceptance rates further decline, my blame will lay almost solely upon them. I fail to see how it couldn't. Genuine insanity has overtaken the loudest and most vocal of the group, and for people who aren't trans, the majority of what they see is astoundingly repulsive. Take for instance conversations surrounding genital preferences. Heterosexuals are now called bigots because they aren't sexually attracted to men with vaginas or women with penises. I've witnessed firsthand as gay men were labeled homophobic because they aren't willing to date female-to-male trans men. But come on! It shouldn't shock anybody that gay men aren't particularly excited by the prospect of chowing down on clam. Yet in today's age, that's now discriminatory, which is a frustrating turn of events. It's new age conversion therapy, a concerted effort to shame and gaslight people into having sexual attractions to those they otherwise wouldn't, which is the antithesis of what sexuality even is. I hate needing to explain this, but people cannot help who they are drawn towards. As a trans person, I too have my own preferences. I like dick. That doesn't make me a bigot. It's not like I'm making a conscious decision to not be sexually aroused by most women or females to males. I just happen to be biologically gay. I was born male, and I like others who are the same. At the risk of sounding crass, I have an innate repulsion towards vagina. It's just not sexy to me. Sorry, ladies. Likewise, I'm not turned on by surgically crafted penises. This isn't because I hold negative views towards female-to-male transgenders. I actually know quite a few and they're pretty fucking rad. I just don't want to have sexual relations with them. And it's not because I don't view or respect them as the males they identify as. Personally, I do see them as dudes and I treat them thusly. But sexuality is very biological in nature. It's deeply rooted within the brain, past the realm of conscious thought. And so someone who was born female doesn't turn me on, no matter how well they pass as a man. That is sexuality in a nutshell, and it's driven by the makeup of our thinking machines. It's not something that can be changed at will, which is why you shouldn't fault a straight man who isn't interested in a trans woman. Centuries of evolution and animalistic development could be driving his brain towards finding a partner who can carry on his lineage with the birth of a child. Obviously, this isn't the case with everybody, as sexuality and its goals throughout our species are quite fluid. Some people don't want kids and others just use sex for pleasure. But that doesn't change why someone who is completely straight might not be interested in a biological equal. Their brain simply isn't turned on by it, no different than why I am not aroused by my biological opposite. It was once common knowledge among gay activists that sexuality is not a choice, which makes it highly irritating that the opposite has now gained traction. We've legitimately reached the point of suck the dick bigot, and it unironically sucks. People are being made into villains for no good reason, and who in their right mind would want to stick around for that? It's a regression of what LGBT activism once stood for, and to reiterate an earlier point, it's going to cause long-term harm to the widespread acceptance of trans individuals, and perhaps even gays as a whole. Consider it for a moment. When people who hold no hatred towards the transgendered community are still painted as discriminatory for not being romantically attracted to them, what do you think they're gonna do? I'll tell you, they're gonna throw up that middle finger and walk away. What reason do they have not to? Anything and everything can result in them being buried under accusations of transphobia, and no one in their right mind wants to be villainized when they're well aware they did nothing wrong, so they're gonna pack up their bags to escape the craziness. More so as it has no end in sight. Take my use of the term biological sex. Uttering it has gotten me, a trans person, labeled transphobic. But let's not beat around the bush. I was born biologically male. My chromosomes, bone structure, genitals, and overall physical body are that of a dude. When I die, if my bones are dug up at a later date, I'll be marked down as male. Not because this fictional archaeologist or grave robber is transphobic. It's just that all he has to go off are my remaining physical traits. Markers which won't reflect the workings of my brain, but instead the physical body I inhabited. My literal biology. There's a reason trans people need to transition. We're trying to build a facade around our physical being. Take my voice. This isn't how I spoke for much of my life. It used to be much deeper. How I now sound is still relatively new, and it took 2 years of vocal training to get it to a point where I sound sorta passable, which is in some ways a handicap, because this is my normal voice, and I can be much more expressive when I speak like this. It's also much easier on the ears, and no doubt my YouTube channel would do far better if I always spoke like this. I'm not dumb. It doesn't escape me that my tranny voice is a turnoff, but I talk like this because my normal voice is a source of dysphoria, and also because I'm doing what I can to present myself how I want to be seen. That is the trans experience, changing who you are to fit in as the gender you identify as. And we do so because biologically we are not what we identify as, which should not be offensive to state. It's just the reality of the situation. I was born male, so I take monthly leuprolide injections and wear itchy estrogen patches to change my body into how I want to be seen. And as much as it sucks for some to admit, being born one way and living as another comes with some limitations. There's baggage there, which more trans people need to accept, especially as it pertains to athletics. Transgender swimmer Leah Thomas just won a Division I national championship, and understandably it's caused quite a stir. She previously swam in the men's division where she lagged a bit behind the competition, but post-transition she's been competing against natural-born women, and now she's on top. To say she has an unfair advantage might be an understatement. She is biologically male, and with that comes physical traits which give her an edge. There's a reason genders are separated when it comes to most athletic competitions. Men and women are just built differently, and even with lower testosterone, Leah Thomas arguably benefits from her biology. A bigger heart, bigger lungs, more muscle mass, larger hands, and larger feet, just to name a few. She also didn't transition until later in life, so she has the benefits of male puberty. As is to be expected though, none of this can be discussed or debated without activists whipping out their favorite word and smacking everyone in the face with accusations of transphobia, which is intellectually dishonest, as there is a valid debate to be had when it comes to transgender athletes, and it is not transphobic to broach it. In fact, disallowing it will only create more contempt towards such athletes. The average person right now is seeing Leah Thomas plastered all over the news media, and I'd argue that a majority of them sense that it's wrong. How dare she go from losing to men to eviscerating women? It seems backwards, almost like it's cheating in the name of progressivism. What the solution is, I don't know. I'm not a sports person, I don't watch them and I don't play them, so I'm a little ignorant on the subject, although I will say that I don't believe transgender athletes should be barred from competing at all, but I also don't believe they should be allowed to compete in instances where they have a clear advantage against those they are competing against, not unless all parties consent, and if the Leah Thomas situation is any indicator, not all female athletes consent to biological men invading their spaces. Like most things, this isn't black and white though. Leah's times have degraded since she transitioned, so hormones have in some way negatively affected her ability to swim, and her score doesn't surpass the fastest recorded women's speeds. But there's still physical traits which give her an advantage over others in the pool, and this was why I'm in favor of more knowledgeable people debating it. We need more input and honest discussion. Personally, I'd like to see transgender leagues or trans-specific rankings rise up where trans athletes compete against other trans athletes. That seems like the cleanest and most sensible solution. Let them have their own records to smash and fight over. It would certainly lead to far less controversy, and I fail to see it having major negative consequences towards the widespread social acceptance of trans people. Let us disengage it from the culture war. They can take up their own corner in peace. It'd probably have a healthier impact too. How many trans individuals avoid various activities because of the controversy that'll entail? Few want to be the center of attention in that regard. I certainly wouldn't want to compete against men or biological women, and so I wonder if trans-specific scoreboards would get more trans folk into sports. There's obviously problems in getting such a thing off the ground, but it wouldn't hurt to try. Regardless though, for now, I think trans athletes who break records and win medals deserve a giant asterisk next to their names. It's important for me to stress that everything I've said isn't to say that trans people shouldn't be acknowledged or respected as the gender they identify as. I believe they should be. Transgenderism is a legitimate condition that affects a small percentage of the population. I know some have difficulty wrapping their heads around the notion of a man believing himself a woman or vice versa, but brains are a complicated thing, and during its development phase, things can go wonky. Considering how a baby forms, it's truly not far-fetched for a brain to go in the opposite direction of what chromosomes dictate. I won't spend too much time discussing this next point, so keeping things as oversimplified as possible, a fetus technically begins its existence as female. Chromosomes and hormones then lead it down one physical path of development or another. Some things, however, remain unchanged. That's why men have nipples. It's a relic of their feminine origin. Not discussed often enough is that the brain goes through a gender process as well. This is due to something called DNA methylation, or DNMT as I'll call it going forward. Researchers at the University of Maryland even toyed with the DNMT levels of developing rats, and they were able to alter their sex characteristics and behaviors. They essentially masculinized the brains of female rodents, which highlights how it's within the realm of possibility for a brain to become behaviorally misgendered, diverging from the outwardly biological form. This isn't me arguing that DNMT misfire is solely why trans people exist. I actually think there's many environmental factors leading to the influx we see today, but I am trying to stress that brain development is a fickle thing and trans people are a developmental fluke. We're anomalies, not much different than those who are born physically intersex. Them and I are on a somewhat similar spectrum. That's why most trans people know something is off at a very young age. It's deeply rooted within the brain. This is why I'm for adults transitioning who have been properly diagnosed as trans. It is a real thing that exists, and which has existed for far longer than people realize. Although, transition shouldn't be a fast process, and I think safety protocols are a must, lest we see an untold amount of people ruin their lives, which we are tragically already beginning to witness. Did you know, due to something called informed consent, someone can simply walk into a Planned Parenthood or an LGBT clinic in a number of states and receive hormones within a single day? There are no longer any meaningful fail-safes besides a basic blood draw, and I find this to be immensely dangerous. For those unaware, informed consent essentially allows a patient to accept the burden of responsibility so long as they understand the risks associated with various meds. Trans activists believe this prevents medical gatekeeping. As they describe it, the drugs should be as readily available as other basic meds a doctor may prescribe. Think painkillers after tooth surgery or something. The problem, of course, is that hormones aren't on the same plane of existence as painkillers or cough medicine. These drugs alter the body, with a number of irreversible side effects. It should not in any way be something someone can obtain within a week of coming out of the closet. Throw in affirmative care, and it only gets worse from there. Affirmative care makes it so a doctor must affirm the identity of a patient. They will not heavily question a person who claims to be trans. Their job is now to go along with it, which is silly. A doctor wouldn't just trust someone who said they're schizophrenic or bipolar and hand them hardcore psychoactive medications. No, they test them and ensure the pills are the right call. But where trans people are concerned, here in the States, it's becoming far less common. I previously reported on detransitioners after speaking to a number of them, and a common through line was the speed at which they were able to obtain medication. This I can corroborate with my own history. Within a month of seeing a doctor for the first time ever about my gender problems, I was offered hormones. I ultimately waited a little bit longer because I wanted to ensure it was the right call, and as someone who dislikes medication in general, I wanted to make sure I had a grasp of the potential side effects. But that doesn't change the fact that within 30 days of leaving the closet, I could have started HRT. It is worth stating that for me, it wouldn't have had a negative effect because I am in fact trans and the meds improved my life. But there are a ton of people slipping through the cracks and it needs to be addressed. Adding to the confusion are the online communities pushing young people towards HRT. Trans discussions have proliferated the social media landscape, and confused youth are going to activists for help, and in some instances, they are being led astray. In the previously mentioned report of mine, I spoke to a young man who enjoys cross-dressing. This activity gave him conflicted emotions and he thought maybe he was trans. So he fell into a community of mostly older individuals who kept pressuring him to transition, telling him he'd be unhappy if he waited too long, that he'd miss the boat and have diminishing returns. He voiced his hesitancy, but they pushed, and in his confusion, he believed he was trans, so he went to an LGBT clinic in New York, and that exact same day, he was able to get hormones, which he took for quite a few months before he realized it wasn't improving his life, so he stopped, and he's been much better since. That recounting should alarm any sensible person. There was simply no process to weed out somebody like him, and we are now beginning to see the consequences of this. Just recently, there was something called Detrans Awareness Day, and social media was full of stories of people who fell into the trans trap and began transitioning only to hate themselves for it. And let me tell you, some of these stories are tragic. From girls cutting their boobs off at a young age to men snipping their genitals. People are forever altering their bodies because doctors are now affirming their gender instead of questioning and ensuring that transition is the right call. This is why I don't agree with kids having medical procedures or even starting meds. If a child is potentially trans, I think the best option is to support and love them. Let them act as their true authentic selves, but hold off on the drugs until they're older. I think 18 is the best place to start, assuming they've been seeing a doctor about it for a lengthy period of time, and assuming they're in fact trans. Without fail though, even though I fully support people transitioning and living their best lives, because I disagree on when the best time to start is, I've been called transphobic. Even detransitioners have come under attack for daring to tell their tales, which, for lack of a better term, is fucked up. Where's the compassion? A detransitioner isn't inherently evil. They're just people who are let down by a medical apparatus that values itself based on how many medications it can shill and not how many people it can save. They've also been let down by activists who are playing into Big Pharma's hands by fighting to remove every possible safety net. That's why activists should shut up for once. They're wrong. Plain and simple, they are wrong. The moves they are making are harmful. Or, to use a phrase they love, it's problematic. With no strict guidelines to prevent misdiagnoses, the rate of detransitioners will only go up, and inevitably it will result in anti-transgender backlash. This is exactly the reason why we need to throw out affirmative care. A doctor should question their patients, at least to a certain degree. They certainly shouldn't be stonewalls that let nobody through, but they also shouldn't be open doors. It's baffling how they no longer do their due diligence. It breaks every oath they've sworn. Secondly, LGBT clinics and Planned Parenthood should be forbidden from prescribing anybody hormones within a day, let alone a week or a month. I'm not calling for years here, but at least 12 months should be the standard of care before any potential trans person can begin HRT. This would ensure fewer confused individuals make a major mistake. I'm often called transphobic, but I do care for the future well-being of other trans people. Previous sections of this video should make it clear that I have their best interests in mind. There's the logic behind everything I'm expressing, and it's important to me that genuine trans people be able to be themselves. Because to circle back to an earlier point, transgenderism exists. It's real, and there is a scientific explanation behind it. But annoyingly, activists rarely want to educate the public on how and why we develop the way that we do. And while I can't say with exact precision the reason why this is, I do believe it has to do with what I've already covered, and it's that these days, acknowledging one's biology is considered an oppressive act. There is a widespread emotional delusion guiding them. They want to deny the reality of their existence, so they act as if they are 100% female, even at times suggesting they have periods and the like, and anyone who says otherwise is a bigot. No exaggeration, I've been called a transphobic TERF for acknowledging that I was born male, but acknowledging that reality and the baggage which accompanies it should not be grounds for ostracization. But ostracization it is, and today's highly vocal side of the trans community relishes in excommunication. You're either 100% with them or against them. There is no middle ground. Just recently, I was bombarded with comments calling me a self-loather, a transphobe, a pick-me, a fake trans person, and someone even said they hoped to see me get hate crimed. Why was all this said? I disagreed with the notion that it's transphobic for someone to not be attracted to a trans person. That's all. I disagreed with suck the dick bigot, so I'm to be cast aside. For me, it's no big deal. I'm a loner by default, and I'm very comfortable being alone. A relaxing vacation is escaping by myself to a hotel room for a week, so a bunch of people screaming at me and kicking me out of the club is whatever. I actually have fun with it. But I'm an anomaly in that regard, because a lot of trans people are in want of companionship and allies. Being trans isn't easy, it's sometimes scary, oftentimes uncomfortable, and fitting in can be awkward as hell. There is a deep fear of rejection, and it's not completely unfounded. So here we have a vulnerable group of individuals who are not allowed to disagree with their peers lest they be branded a traitor and kicked out of their good graces, which is a messed up situation for a statistically depressed and lonely individual to find themselves within. Toss in the endless waves of hate they potentially face for merely disagreeing with a single point of view, and it is enough to break them. I can't stress it enough. It's a very toxic environment that activists have created, and I don't doubt for a second it's led to suicide attempts or worse. But it's also an environment only other trans people can clean up, which means I gotta toughen up and start pushing back. I know for a fact many trans people are upset with the activist side of things. I get a lot of messages from them, but none of them want to voice their opinions publicly because they don't want to be dogpiled and attacked. A lot of them are also left-leaning, and they're terrified they'll be stranded alone should they voice their concerns. A valid fear given how prevalent cancel culture on that side is. Although, even acknowledging that, I gotta say, that excuse can only go so far. No one can save them but them, which is hard to hear for a group that tends to relish in victim culture, but it is what it is. They need to start coping because crying at everything doesn't build strength. It's regressive and repulsively toxic. I gotta be blunt here. Nobody likes those who are always screeching mad. It's why the Karen meme exists, and the vocal side of the trans community has become Karen on crack. Every day there's some new outrage or controversy, and it's a cesspool that is impossible to navigate without slipping and taking a plunge. There exists no safe or clean path to be found. At some point, you will be called a bigot over something silly. Actors know this well enough, as it's now considered off limits for non-trans actors to play the role of a trans character, which is backwards in so many ways. First of all, the entire point of acting is to roleplay as people and things you aren't in real life. It's about pushing yourself to understand and embody that which you are not. Why put boxes around artistic freedom, especially as it could create a stifling two-way street? Do trans actors only ever want to be cast as trans characters? I doubt it. That doesn't sound fun. Typecasting is boring. But that's the precedent that's being set. Trans play trans, gays play gays, Jews play Jews, and straights play straights, among many other things. It's all just so narrow-minded and short-sighted. I'd further argue that non-trans actors playing trans characters could provide some positives too. As to play that role adequately, they'd need to get into the minds of people like me, which might help others understand how and why we are as we are. The activist mindset just doesn't care though, not even when their outrage has negative consequences, such as when they got an entire film cancelled. Scarlett Johansson was set to play Dante Gill in the movie Rub and Tug, but because the role didn't go to a trans man, the outrage machine lit up, forcing Scarlett to back out, leading to the cancellation of the movie as a whole, which is disappointing. The film was set to tell the story of a lesser-known trans man born in the 1930s, and with a big-name actor attached, it could have helped spread some of the history of trans people. I guess trans stories aren't important after all. At least if the activists are to be believed. Which, speaking of, telling the true tales of actual trans people by trans people has been deemed inappropriate by non-trans activists. This is how we know the wheels have come off the bus. In a PC Gamer review of the hit indie title RimWorld, the author Sam Greer lashed out at the game's heteronormativity before describing backstories of its trans characters as reductive. The kicker? Sam Greer isn't trans, and the trans stories she writes off as heteronormative were written by actual trans people. They were financial backers of the game who had an opportunity to submit their own stories. It was their own personal tales. Something Sam said left a bad taste in her mouth. Sticking with gaming for another moment, on January 22nd, 2018, Waypoint Games, aka Vice, tweeted out an article with the caption "Don't Dead Name Ever." The accompanying article made the bold proclamation that the tiny indie game The Red Strings Club falls into the pitfalls of transphobia. This because near the end of the experience, it's revealed that a character is trans after their pre-transition name is used as some sort of reveal. Within the context of the story, it makes sense because the password is used by an abusive ex, and shocker, an abusive ex probably wouldn't respect the gender identity of their former partner. Regardless though, the Vice piece describes the reveal as offensive. There's one minor hiccup. The Red Strings Club was developed by a small team of 3 people, and one of them is trans. The author of the Vice piece is not. Even after it was revealed that a trans person wrote the segment, the journalist doubled down on it being transphobic. If you can't already tell, there's a strict rigidity within trans activism. Time and time again, they describe stuff as transphobic, even when trans people had a hand in its creation. The accusations aren't without harm either, because often the people that they're lending their hate towards get dogpiled and bullied, as is what happened to the game developer on the Red Strings Club. There's just no winning here. The only good tranny is one who toes a strict ideological line. As for everyone else, they haven't got a shot in hell of getting through unscathed. Even simple grammatical mistakes can get someone mucked up. For instance, did you know saying transgendered with an ED at the end is enough to get you labeled transphobic? The same goes for saying trans woman without a space between trans and woman. To an outsider, this is impenetrable. It's a game with rules being made up on the spot with the intention of making you lose. No matter what you say or do, you'll eventually be called transphobic, and this is because the modern trans activist wants to be a victim. It's the new social currency, and people are racing to the bottom to prove they have it the worst. Nowhere is this more apparent than the trans murder rate. This stupid statistic acts as nothing more than a bludgeon, one whipped out time and time again, serving as a tool to win or silence any argument. Dislike a joke? Pull out the trans murder rate and state it's getting trans people killed. Upset with the video game? Pull it out and say it leads to real world harm. Truly, anything and everything results in its use. But there's one major catch. The murder rate is a load of bunk.
Drop the knife.
Come on, let's drop it.
Drop it. Shoot me. No, drop the knife.
Knife.
Drop the knife.
Every year, various political organizations tally the trans people who were murdered and tout it as proof in a rise of anti-transgender violence. The media then lazily echoes the sentiment without doing any proper digging, which is a disservice to the public, because should one dig into the list, they'll learn that the risk of being murdered over one's gender identity is actually pretty low. In many instances, gender identity played zero part in why someone was killed. Consider 2017 when Kiwi Haring, Scout Schultz, and Sean Hake were killed by police in different states on different dates because they charged at law enforcement with knives. Why are they included on a list of anti-transgender violence, and why is the media raising this count as proof that trans people face a disproportionate amount of hate? This was a policing and mental instability issue, not a gender one. Worth noting that in 2017, multiple non-trans people were killed by the police for the very same reason, including a pregnant woman in Seattle. I'm not cherry-picking deaths to downplay a significant problem either. Sticking with 2017, a trans man by the name of Kashmir Nazir Red was killed by his partner after an instance of domestic abuse. The Human Rights Campaign lied through omission when reporting on this when they wrote about how the transgender community is disproportionately represented in domestic violence cases across the country, painting a picture that depicts Kashmir as a victim. But should you peel back the curtain and investigate, you'd see that Kashmir was the instigator. He was abusing his partner and she stabbed him in self-defense. She was eventually cleared of all charges. If you're keeping tally, that's already 4 deaths out of 29 on the 2017 list that are already misplaced. And we can continue to remove others. Take Ava LaRae Barron. She was a trans person who was shot and killed by another trans person. The shooter eventually had the case dismissed as an act of self-defense. It was the victim who'd instigated the fight. Similarly, J.Lo McGlory was shot and killed by Desmond Dante Harris after she allegedly tried to rape him. A jury found him not guilty. Jumping ahead to 2019 is not much better. The HRC counted 25 murders, and at least 8 of them definitively have nothing to do with the gender identity of the victim. One of them, Jordan Kofor, just happened to be a victim of a mass shooting in Dayton, Ohio. It was purely the wrong place at the wrong time, as the shooter was there to get anyone he could. A genuine tragedy for sure, but not a case of anti-transgender violence. Worst yet is Jaslyn Ware. For the better part of a year, she was included on the 2019 list, even getting cited by politicians trying to snag the LGBT vote. But there's a catch. She wasn't even murdered. She died of natural causes. As for all the other deaths on most years' lists, there's no proof the majority of them had anything to do with gender. Many are the victims of gang violence, or were killed by their romantic partners after fights broke out. And don't get me wrong, that's not to say every murder isn't a hate crime. No doubt some people are killed because of their identity, but it's far rarer than we're led to believe. But because activists want to be victims, breaking the stat down and proving that trans people are safer than believed has led to me being called transphobic. Explain that. How is disproving a lie transphobic? I am explicitly showing that we are less likely to be murdered because we are trans. This is a good thing. I am less likely to be murdered than the stat suggests, yet somehow I'm the bad guy for breaking it down. It's mind-numbingly stupid. It's almost as if transphobia is a go-to word anytime trans activists are faced with something they don't want to hear, regardless of the facts. They just want to be angry, they just want to be sad, they just want to be miserable, and it fucking sucks because they are bringing the rest of us down with them. As I said way earlier, they are repulsive, and the endless nonsense and lies are so blatant and misleading that the natural result is that more enemies and actual transphobia rise up in response. They are bad actors who are giving ammo and megaphones to other bad actors. The ammo metaphor is self-explanatory, but the megaphone you may be wondering about. Recall how throughout this entire video I've mentioned how certain rhetoric will push away and alienate various individuals. Well, that megaphone will be used to draw them towards a new line of thinking, one that looks down on the LGBT. This is a tactic that bad actors have used for centuries. You find the people who are upset with and alienated by the status quo or whatever else, and you play into those negative emotions, be they justified or not. And today's activists have given genuine homophobes all they need to grow their numbers, and it's sickening. Likewise, the craziness playing out across the West is what authoritarian countries will use to further justify their crackdowns on gay and trans people. We have already seen this in China and Russia. It's the slippery slope come alive, and activists are the ones who lubed up the incline. They have sabotaged us, shot us in the foot, and left us crippled, and I don't know if we can rebound. Currently, there's no end to the insanity in sight, and by the time it draws near, it might be way too late. I opened this video by saying trans activists are my biggest enemy. And I mean it. I stand by it 100%. They're setting us so far back, always focusing on the wrong things. For example, why try to get gender reassignment surgeries for prisoners? Not even law-abiding trans people can easily get them. Then there's all the hatred towards non-trans people, typically called cis. You'll notice I avoided using that word throughout this entire project, and that was intentional. It's too often used as an insult, so I avoid it. It's another thing that has become repulsive to non-trans people, and I didn't want to push them away with my own words. Hilariously, I've even been called cis by trans activists trying to belittle my points. It was used as an attack because they weren't aware I was a tranny. Not even women's shelters are safe from activist rage. Back in 2018, a woman by the name of Christy Hanna was more than half a year deep into her stay at a shelter for recovering addicts in Toronto, Canada. As a victim of sexual abuse, she had fallen into various substances and had gone there to seek help. This took a turn for the worse when she was given a trans roommate. The individual was pre-op, meaning they still had a penis, and they had facial and chest hair. Hannah described them as male-bodied. On top of that, the roommate publicly made lewd comments about other women being hot. This upset others staying at the shelter, and allegedly a petition was signed and given to the staff, a move which fell on deaf ears. As was reported at the time by the National Post, the sharing of a room with someone who looked like a man and who displayed their penis caused Hannah stress, anxiety, rape flashbacks, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and sleep deprivation. When she reported it to staff, they offered to move her to a new room, but it lacked a door, therefore allowing no privacy, so she left the shelter altogether. Upon leaving, she filed a human rights complaint, and things blew up from there. She was immediately vilified by activists and treated as nothing more than a transphobic bully. Maybe it's because I'm a rape victim who battles my own forms of PTSD, but if I was forced to share a room with an unknown entity who presented largely as male, I too might be triggered. It doesn't matter what they identify as because PTSD doesn't distinguish nuance like that. And where Christy is concerned, that's essentially what happened. PTSD be damned though, because Christy was raked over the coals, as was anyone who defended her, myself included. Worse still is that vandals began defacing shelters that excluded trans women. It's sickening. Trans people want all the compassion and acceptance in the world, yet in many cases they're not willing to be as equally understanding. Few in this community seem to have any basic understanding of the various reasons why our presence may be triggering to some, especially in a women's shelter that houses rape victims. That's not to say trans women don't deserve help, and most definitely there should be women's shelters open to them. But there should also be shelters that exclude them, and they should be allowed to remain vandalism free. As you've hopefully gathered by now, a lot of people call me a self-loather, but I don't loathe myself, nor do I loathe the fact that I'm trans. I just loathe the community I've been forcibly grouped into, and I think it's understandable why a lot of other people do too. The entire environment created by trans activists is nauseating. Literal children aren't even safe. They are props to be sexualized. Look at Desmond. When he was 11 years old, he twirled around on stage in drag as men whooped and hollered and threw money his way. That wasn't a one-off instance. Throughout the past couple years, other similar moments have begun to stack up. A then 10-year-old drag queen named Lactatia released a photo in 2019 that showed him smiling as he stood next to a naked 27-year-old man. Lactatia, by the way, is touted as inspirational and incredible by the media. Meanwhile, Desmond pretended to snort ketamine while live streaming with an adult drag performer as they read incoming comments such as "Hitler did nothing wrong." This fact didn't bother media sites like the Huffington Post, which raised him as proof that the future is queer. Frankly, it's all so very disgusting, and no sane person can look at it and not be worried at what we are condoning when it comes to the youth. Yet in a tale as old as time, expressing disgust is grounds for being labeled transphobic, or in my case, a Nazi. No joke, I was literally called a Nazi by a leftist YouTuber because I opposed the media praise of Lactatia and Desmond. Although, if opposing a kid dancing on stage for money is what being a Nazi is, then I'll wear that armband with pride because I oppose all of this, and I have the foresight to see the damage it's going to cause. I mean, look at the screen. This is a viral TikTok video where a drag queen danced suggestively to a little girl seated in a chair as his ass was hanging out, and people were clapping and cheering for it. This isn't right, and it highlights a devolution of trans and gay activism. This stuff keeps happening and they don't push back and fight against it, and when it is addressed, it's touted as proof of a progressive, queer-friendly future, which is a load of hogwash. This isn't proof of the future being queer, it's proof that activism has gone off the rails. For if they truly cared about the future well-being of people like me, they'd push back hard against all of this, because it's not hard to see the detrimental effect it's going to have. Or as I said almost 40 minutes ago, if acceptance rates further decline, my blame will lay solely upon them. I fail to see how it couldn't. Thanks for watching.
Been said, it's just a phase, like a red smile on my face. I know what I could be, and I do struggle with destiny, and I get through. No wonder I feel blessed.